My 10-year-old daughter came home from school, and her key didn't fit the lock. She stood on the porch for 5 hours in a miserable, soaking November rain, waiting for someone to let her in. When my mother finally opened the door, it wasn't to welcome her. It was to look down at my shivering child and say, "We have all decided you and your mom don't live here anymore." I didn't find this out from my mother, of course. I found out from a neighbor who called me at work, her voice tight with fury, telling me my daughter was huddled under her carport, blue-lipped and crying. When I finally got there and faced my mother, I didn't shout. I just looked at her perfectly coiffed hair and her unapologetic expression and said, "Understood." 3 days later, my mother received a letter, and the life she understood came to a screeching halt. Family politics are their own special kind of warfare. It's a slow burn conflict fought over decades, with battlefields disguised as dining room tables and holidays that serve as ceasefires but never peace treaties. In my family, the lines were drawn before I was even old enough to understand them. My sister Clara was the sun. Everything and everyone orbited her. I was the moon, reflecting her light when it was convenient and otherwise existing in the shadows, useful for pulling the tides of domestic duty and emotional labor. I remember my 8th birthday. I'd asked for a specific doll, the one with the real hair you could style. I'd talked about it for months. On the morning of my party, Clara, who was 10, threw a tantrum. She didn't want a doll, she wanted a chemistry set. My father, ever the peacekeeper, disappeared for an hour and returned with the biggest, most expensive chemistry set the toy store sold. At my party, I opened my gifts. No doll. Instead, my parents presented me with a set of encyclopedias. "For your future," my mother said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Later, I saw Clara in the backyard, showing off her new chemistry set to all my friends, who were now her audience. I found the doll I'd wanted hidden in the back of my mother's closet a week later. It was a gift for Clara, for getting a good report card. I never mentioned it. I learned early that my wants were secondary. They were inconvenient. This dynamic solidified as we grew up. Clara was the artist, the free spirit. This was the family-approved narrative for why she couldn't hold down a job, why she was always in some kind of financial jam that only our parents could solve. I was the responsible one. The one who got a scholarship, worked 2 jobs through college, and built a stable life. But in our family, responsible was just another word for boring. And stable meant I was the one they could lean on without fear of collapse. When my husband left, my carefully constructed stability shattered. The divorce was messy and expensive. I lost my job shortly after, a casualty of corporate restructuring. Suddenly, I was a single mother with a dwindling savings account and a daughter, Lily, who needed me to be her rock when I felt like sand. My parents made the offer. "Come home," my mother had said, her voice dripping with magnanimity. "The house is big enough. We can help with Lily. It's the least we can do." It felt less like a life raft and more like an anchor. But I had no choice. So Lily and I moved back into my childhood bedroom. The first few months were a study in passive aggression. My mother would tidy my room, rearranging my things, throwing out items she deemed clutter. My father would make comments about the grocery bill, conveniently forgetting I was contributing a significant portion of my unemployment benefits to the household. Clara, who lived 20 minutes away in a chic apartment subsidized by them, would visit and treat me like the hired help. "Could you grab me a latte? You're not busy," she'd say, not looking up from her phone. Lily saw it all. Children are like emotional seismographs. They register the tremors we adults pretend not to feel. She'd come to me at night, her small face pinched with worry. "Why doesn't Grandma like my drawings?" she'd whisper. "She said they were messy." Or, "Aunt Clara told me my shoes were scuffed. She said it makes the family look bad." I'd hold her tight and tell her that Grandma was just particular, that Aunt Clara didn't mean it. Lies. They were lies I told to protect her from a truth I could barely face myself. We were tolerated, not loved. We were a temporary inconvenience they were putting up with for the sake of appearances. The house itself was a museum of their priorities. The living room was a shrine to Clara. Her art, smears of angry color on canvas, hung on every wall. Her graduation photos were on the mantelpiece, front and center. My own college degree was in a box in the attic. My father had once mumbled something about needing the wall space for a more cohesive aesthetic. The tension had been escalating for weeks before the day with the lock. Clara had announced she and her new, equally insufferable boyfriend, Mark, were buying a house. A beautiful house, far beyond their means. It required a massive down payment. I overheard hushed, frantic conversations between her and my parents. Words like loan, equity, and obligation floated through the thin walls of my old room. I didn't need to be a detective to piece it together. They were going to leverage their home, the family home, to make Clara's dream a reality. My presence and Lily's was a complication to that plan, a problem that needed to be solved. The day it happened, I was at a job interview across town. A second interview, the kind that lets you feel a flicker of hope. I'd left Lily a key, as I always did. She was a responsible 10-year-old, proud of her independence. She'd let herself in, have a snack, and start her homework. That was the routine, a routine my mother knew perfectly well. My phone buzzed as I was on the bus home. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Gable. "There's a problem," she said, her voice strained. "Lily's been trying to get in your house for hours. She's over here with me now. She's soaked to the bone." The world tilted. I felt the blood drain from my face. Hours? In the rain? I stammered my thanks and told her I was on my way. The rest of the bus ride was a blur of panic. I pictured Lily, alone on that porch, her small hand trying the key again and again, confusion turning to fear. I called my mother's phone. It went straight to voicemail. I called the house line. It rang and rang until the machine picked up. When I finally got to our street, I saw it. The front porch was empty. A small wet backpack was slumped against the door like a fallen soldier. I ran to Mrs. Gable's house. She opened the door before I could knock, her face a mask of pity and rage. And there was Lily, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, shivering on the sofa, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked so small, so fragile. "The key wouldn't work, Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I tried and tried. I thought I broke it." "You didn't break it, sweetie," I said, my own voice dangerously calm. I held her, rocking her, trying to pour all my warmth and strength into her little body. Mrs. Gable filled in the blanks. Lily had been out there since 3:30. It was now almost 8. She had knocked. She had rung the bell. No one answered. Finally, a little after 7, my mother's car had pulled into the driveway. My mother and Clara had gotten out, laughing about something, carrying shopping bags. They saw Lily, according to Mrs. Gable, who had been watching from her window. My mother's smile vanished. She didn't rush to Lily. She didn't ask if she was okay. She walked slowly up the path, Clara trailing behind her, looking annoyed. It was then she delivered the line, the verdict. "We have all decided you and your mom don't live here anymore." Then she and Clara had gone inside, closing the door on my daughter. They left her there on the porch, in the dark and the rain, with that sentence hanging in the air. It was the casual cruelty that broke something inside me. They hadn't even packed a bag for her. They hadn't called me. They had simply erased her, erased us. After getting Lily settled and warm at Mrs. Gable's, I walked across the lawn. The lights were on in my parents' house. I could see the flicker of the television. I knocked on the door. It took a long time for anyone to answer. Finally, my father opened it. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, a stooped silhouette of a man I used to respect. "What have you done?" I asked. My voice was quiet, level. All the panic had burned away, leaving something cold and hard in its place. My mother appeared behind him, wiping her hands on an apron. "It was time," she said, as if discussing the weather. "Clara needs our help. You're on your feet now. You have that interview. We can't be your safety net forever." "She is 10 years old," I said, the words feeling like ice chips in my mouth. "You left her outside for 5 hours." Clara drifted into the hallway, a wine glass in her hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. She's fine. Mrs. Gable took her in. You're making this about you, as usual." I looked at their 3 faces, my enabling father, my cruel mother, my golden sister. They were a united front, a tribunal that had passed judgment without a trial. They had weighed my daughter's well-being against Clara's desire for a new house and found it wanting. "Understood," I said. And I turned and walked away. I didn't beg, I didn't argue, I didn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. In that moment, pleading was a language I no longer spoke. I went back to Mrs. Gable's, collected my daughter, and we spent the night at a cheap motel. As Lily slept, I sat in the dark, the hum of the ice machine outside the only sound. The hurt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. But underneath it, something else was taking root, a cold resolve. This was not just an injustice, it was a declaration of war. and they had no idea what kind of weapon they had just handed me. 2 months prior, my father had come to my room with a dusty cardboard box. He'd seemed agitated, looking over his shoulder as if my mother might appear at any moment. "Your grandmother wanted you to have these," he'd mumbled, pushing the box into my hands. "Just some old papers. Keep them safe." I'd thanked him, puzzled, and slid the box under my bed, dismissing it as one of his sentimental, slightly eccentric gestures. I assumed it was old photographs or letters. I was wrong. In the sterile quiet of that motel room, I remembered the box. The next morning, I called Mrs. Gable and asked her the biggest favor of my life. Could she go to the house, say she was collecting a few more of Lily's things, and retrieve that specific box from under my bed? My mother, she explained, had already packed our belongings into black trash bags and left them on the porch. The box, however, was still there, an oversight, a crucial mistake. Later that day, Mrs. Gable met me at a coffee shop, the box on the seat beside her. I spent the next 2 hours sifting through its contents. It was mostly what I expected. My grandmother's diaries, old report cards, yellowed photos, but at the very bottom, in a thick manila envelope, was the arsenal. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had been a formidable woman, sharp, shrewd, and with a deep distrust of her son-in-law's weak will and her own daughter's grasping nature. I found a letter from her lawyer, dated shortly before her death 15 years ago, and with it, a copy of her will and the deed to the house. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. My grandmother had not left the house to my parents. She had placed it in an irrevocable trust. My mother and father were granted lifetime tenancy, the right to live in the house until their deaths, under a very specific set of conditions. They were caretakers, not owners. The house, the actual property itself, was to be held in trust for me, her only other granddaughter at the time, to be transferred to my name, free and clear, upon my 30th birthday. I had turned 31 the year before. My breath caught in my throat. I read it again. The trust had a clause, a beautifully vicious, prescient clause. The lifetime tenancy was contingent upon them maintaining the property and, most importantly, acting in the best interests of the beneficiary's well-being and familial harmony. It explicitly stated that any action that resulted in the unjust exclusion of the beneficiary or her direct descendants from the property would render their tenancy null and void. They hadn't just changed the locks on a tenant. They had illegally evicted the legal owner. They had voided their own contract with a ghost. For years they had let me believe I was living there on their charity, when in fact, they were the ones living on mine. The money they were planning to pull out for Clara's down payment wasn't their equity. It was my inheritance. They were trying to steal my house to give to my sister. The weight in my chest didn't disappear. It transformed. It solidified from the nebulous ache of grief into the solid, heavy certainty of purpose. The tears stopped. The shaking in my hands ceased. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the holder of a truth that could dismantle their entire world. Waiting for them to do the right thing was over. It was time to make them. The first call I made was to a lawyer. Not a family friend, but the toughest divorce and property lawyer I could find. A woman whose online reviews used words like shark and relentless. Her name was Ms. DeMarco. I got an appointment for the next morning. I laid the documents out on her polished mahogany desk. She read them in silence, her expression unreadable. She read them twice. Then she looked up at me over the top of her glasses, and a slow, cold smile spread across her face. "Well, this is something," she said, her voice a low purr. "They gift-wrapped it for you, didn't they?" She confirmed everything I had suspected. The trust was ironclad. My grandmother had been meticulous. My parents had zero ownership rights. Their attempt to take out a home equity loan would have been fraud. Their changing the locks and throwing my daughter and me out was a catastrophic breach of the trust's terms. "They aren't just in the wrong," Ms. DeMarco explained, leaning forward. "They are legally adrift. You don't just own the house. You have grounds to have them removed, immediately." The plan we formulated wasn't about shouting or emotional confrontation. It was about cold, hard, inescapable logistics. It was about ink on paper, which, as my grandmother clearly knew, beats opinions and feelings every single time. We drafted 2 documents. The first was a formal letter from Ms. DeMarco's office to my parents, informing them that their lifetime tenancy was terminated, effective immediately, due to their breach of the trust's conditions. It cited the exact clause they had violated. The second document was a legal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. 30 days is generous, Ms. DeMarco noted. Legally, we could probably push for less, but this gives them no room to claim they're being railroaded. It's standard, it's professional, it's unassailable. The final piece of the plan was the delivery. Sending it by registered mail felt too impersonal, too easy for them to ignore or pretend it got lost. Ms. DeMarco suggested a process server. I had a better idea, an idea that was both strategic and, I will admit, deeply satisfying. Clara's housewarming party was that Saturday. She had been texting me, believe it or not. Not to apologize, but to demand I get over it and confirm if I was bringing a dessert. Don't make this awkward for everyone, one message read. Mom and Dad are helping me so much, the least you can do is show up and be normal. The audacity was breathtaking. It was also the perfect opportunity. The entire family would be there. The flying monkeys, the cousins who always took my parents' side, the aunts who told me I was too sensitive. They would all be there, celebrating the purchase of a house built on a foundation of lies. They would provide the perfect audience. I replied to Clara's text. Of course, wouldn't miss it, I'll bring something. The day of the party, I felt a strange calm. Lily was with Mrs. Gable, who was more of a grandmother to her than my own mother had ever been. I dressed carefully, not in anything flashy, but in a simple, well-fitting dress that made me feel strong. Armor. Ms. DeMarco had told me I didn't need armor, I needed dignity. She was right. Ms. DeMarco met me a block away from Clara's new house. She was dressed in a severe but elegant black suit, carrying a sleek leather portfolio. She looked less like a lawyer and more like a harbinger of fate. Ready? She asked, her eyes sharp. More than ready, I replied. We walked up the brand new cobblestone path to Clara's front door. We could hear the sounds of laughter and music from inside. Through the big picture window, I could see them all. My mother, holding court by the fireplace, my father, looking uncomfortable near the appetizers. Clara, flitting about like a queen in her new castle. They looked happy, entitled, untouchable. I rang the doorbell. Clara opened the door, a champagne flute in her hand. Her smile froze when she saw me, and then faltered completely when she saw Ms. DeMarco standing beside me. "What is this?" she asked, her voice hostile. "Who is this?" "We're here to see Mom and Dad," I said, my voice even. "It's important." We walked past her into the living room. The music stuttered to a halt. Conversations died. Every eye in the room turned to us. My mother's face hardened. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, standing up. "You are making a scene." "No," I said calmly. "I'm ending one." Ms. DeMarco stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence commanded the room. "Are you Carol and David Miller?" she asked, her tone crisp and professional. My father nodded numbly. My mother just stared, her jaw tight. "My name is Annalise DeMarco. I am an attorney representing your daughter," she said, gesturing to me. "I have some documents for you." She opened her portfolio and produced the letters. The silence in the room was so thick you could feel its weight. "We're not accepting anything," my mother snapped. "This is a private party. You need to leave." "I'm afraid it's not a request," Ms. DeMarco said smoothly. She handed a copy of the papers to my mother and another to my father. "This is a letter informing you of the termination of your tenancy at 124 Willow Creek Drive due to a material breach of the terms of the Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust." My mother's face went blank with confusion. "What are you talking about? That's our house." "Actually," Ms. DeMarco continued, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "it is not. The property has been held in trust for my client since her grandmother's passing. You were granted lifetime tenancy, a privilege you voided at approximately 7:30 p.m. on November 12th, when you illegally evicted the property's legal beneficiary and her minor child. That's when it happened. The pale face moment. It started with my father. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, slack gray. He looked down at the paper in his shaking hand as if it were a snake. Then my mother. Her smugness cracked, shattered, and fell away, revealing pure, unadulterated panic. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Clara rushed forward. "This is insane! Mom! Dad! What is she talking about? You own the house!" "They don't," Ms. DeMarco stated flatly, "and any attempt to leverage the property for a loan, as I believe was the plan, would constitute bank fraud. I have already taken the liberty of informing the bank holding the mortgage application for this very lovely new home of the situation." A collective gasp went through the room. Clara looked like she had been slapped. Her eyes darted from Ms. DeMarco to me, then to our parents. The frantic denial began. "We didn't know!" my mother cried, her voice suddenly shrill. "It was a misunderstanding. We were going to tell her about the trust on her birthday. We were just holding it for her." "You changed the locks," I said, speaking for the first time since we entered. My voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent room. "You put our things in trash bags. You told my 10-year-old daughter she didn't have a home anymore. There's no misunderstanding that." The guilt tripping started next. "You're ruining your sister's party!" an aunt squawked from the corner. "After all we've done for you!" my mother shrieked, finally finding her voice. "We took you in, we fed you, and this is how you repay us? By destroying your family?" "You destroyed it," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "You just didn't realize the consequences would ever apply to you." Ms. DeMarco handed them the second document. "This is a formal notice to vacate," she said. "You have 30 days to remove yourselves and your belongings from the property, after which my client will be taking possession." I looked around at the stunned faces of my extended family. They had always seen me as the problem, the one who was too emotional, too difficult. Now they were seeing something else. They were seeing what happens when you push someone past the point of caring about keeping the peace. My father finally spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Where are we supposed to go?" I thought of Lily, shivering under a stranger's carport. I thought of the 5 hours she waited in the rain. I looked at my father, the man who had stood by and watched it happen. And I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said. Then I turned, and with Ms. DeMarco at my side, I walked out the front door, leaving the ruins of the party and my old life behind me. The aftermath was exactly as chaotic as you might imagine. My phone blew up with calls and texts. Aunts, uncles, cousins, the entire Greek chorus of my family weighed in. I was selfish. I was cruel. I was ungrateful. How could I do this to my own parents? They were elderly. Where would they go? I didn't answer a single one. I blocked their numbers. Their opinions were irrelevant. They were the frantic buzzing of flies trapped in a jar. My parents tried to fight it, of course. They hired a lawyer, a small-town guy, who was clearly out of his depth. He sent a blustering letter to Ms. DeMarco, full of words like moral obligation and familial duty. Ms. DeMarco's response was a single page, citing the specific, unbreakable legal statutes they had violated. Their lawyer advised them to comply. There was no case. My grandmother had outplayed them from the grave. Clara was a storm of fury. Her mortgage was, as predicted, denied. The bank wasn't interested in lending a massive sum to a couple with no down payment and whose family was embroiled in a fraud investigation. She and Mark lost the house. She called me screaming, crying, accusing me of being jealous, of intentionally sabotaging her happiness. I listened to her entire tirade without saying a word. When she finally ran out of steam, sputtering into the phone, I said, "Are you finished?" and hung up. The 30 days passed in a flash. On the final day, I drove to the house with a locksmith. My parents were gone. They had taken their furniture, their clothes, and Clara's terrible art. But they had also taken things that weren't theirs. Light fixtures, the antique rose bushes from the garden, the copper weather vane my grandfather had installed. Petty, spiteful acts of a defeated army. It didn't matter. They were just things. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. My father had to go back to work part-time as a consultant to make ends meet. My mother, who hadn't worked in 40 years, was suddenly faced with a budget. The social pillar of her community crumbled. Friends stopped calling. The narrative they tried to spin, that their ungrateful daughter had stolen their home, didn't quite hold up against the legal documents that somehow got leaked to the local gossip mill. Lily and I moved in the following weekend. The house felt empty, not just of furniture, but of the oppressive weight of their judgment. The air was lighter. You can smell a renovation the way you can smell a lie. The house smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, not bleach and resentment. We painted over the beige walls my mother had insisted on. We painted Lily's room a bright, cheerful yellow. We planted a new garden. We reclaimed the space inch by inch. The first night we slept there, Lily came into my room. She crawled into bed with me and curled up against my side. "Is this our house now, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small. "For real?" "Yes, baby," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. "This is our house. For real. No one can ever make us leave again." I felt her small body relax against mine, a deep, shuddering sigh of relief. That was my victory. Not the house, not the money, not the look on my mother's face. It was that sigh. It was the weight leaving my daughter's body. Life became quiet, boring in the best possible way. I got the job I had interviewed for. It was a good job, with good people. I made friends. I started dating a kind, funny man who thought Lily was the brightest kid he'd ever met. We hosted movie nights and barbecues, the house filled with laughter, real laughter, not the brittle, performative kind I had grown up with. I never heard from my parents or my sister again directly. The family grapevine, however, still occasionally dropped a rotten fruit. I heard Clara and Mark broke up under the financial strain. I heard my mother was bitter and isolated. They never apologized. They never took responsibility. They simply recast themselves as the victims in a tragedy I had authored. I expected nothing less. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on the porch watching Lily play in the yard, our yard, I think about that day. The rain, the key, the cold words on the doorstep. It feels like a lifetime ago, a scene from someone else's story. It was the worst day of my life, but it was also the day I was set free. I learned that family isn't an obligation to endure cruelty. It's a sanctuary you build yourself, with walls of respect and doors that only open for those who wish you well. My family is me and my daughter in our sunny yellow house, safe and sound. And that is more than enough. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more.